There's a quote by Mark Rosewater, lead designer on Magic the Gathering for more than 20 years, that for a very long time, I didn't quite understand, and it goes a little something like this. Don't confuse interesting with fun. Now, when I first heard this about a decade ago, I thought it was nonsense. What was he talking about? How can interesting things not be fun? But, over time, with every game I played and the more I learned about how great games get designed, the more I've realised that he might have been right all along. Just not in the way I expected. I first began to consider this when I got stuck into Mewgenics, a tactics roguelike, coincidentally inspired by Magic the Gathering, all about sending cats to do turn-based battle against other cats and sometimes horrible poo monsters. Now, of course, Mewgenics is very good, but one big gripe has always stood out to me, and it's most obvious when it comes to the game's mage class. For those who don't know, the mage is packed with a whole bunch of really awesome abilities like elemental powers that can affect the battlefield, teleportation, and loads of other little combo pieces which all have cool, interesting effects that no other class can do. I was initially very excited about this, as you might expect, but as I played, it became increasingly apparent that not only was it really hard to actually assemble the mage's weird abilities into a functional synergy that felt like it actually did anything, but once I did put together some sort of elemental combo, or a way to make randomly teleporting around useful through lots and lots of grinding on the cat breeding mechanic, I ended up with something that still wasn't very fun to use. My janky mage combos took loads of setup to pull off, could be completely shut down by certain enemies, and to top it all off, were about equally as effective as the other more conventionally designed classes on my team who just kind of click on things to do damage. And the rough part is, the mage isn't alone here. Mewgenics is full of this stuff. Really cool abilities and implied archetypes that nevertheless don't really translate into fun gameplay. Everything from the druid's flower summoning toolkit to the necromancer's self-downing builds are immediately compelling on a theoretical level, but are often so gimmicky and narrowly designed that they're hard to make work. And when you do make them work, you're no longer really playing the fun strategy game that all the other cats are busy with. In other words, they're interesting, but they're not very much fun. Once I'd made this connection in Mewgenics, the differences between interesting and fun design became harder and harder to ignore. For example, it came to mind when I played Mario Kart World. Sure, the idea of an open-world kart racing game is a super cool concept, and there's loads of interesting new course designs that this format allows you to pull off. But in practice, the open-world stuff is mostly just straight, boring motorways that are way less memorable than the actual courses that they end up getting in the way of. This idea came to mind again when I played Slay the Spire 2, a game I'll get back to later, and was shocked to see that it was comparatively small compared to a lot of the other deck builders that had come out in the space between Slay the Spire 1 and the early access of 2. Look at something like Across the Obelisk, for example, a clear Slay the Spire successor that gives you 4 characters to work with at once, about a 50% larger card pool, and a bunch more variety in stats effects and enemies to fight. All things that you'd think would lead to a much greater strategic potential, much more fun deck building, and just a greater number of interesting things to do. But I got bored of that one after just a few runs, whereas Slay the Spire 2 gripped me the moment I started playing and has yet to let go. And, even just on a marketing level, something like FBC Firebreak, that promised a co-op shooter but with the spooky weird vibes of Control, or Crimson Desert, which pitched itself as Dark Souls meets Breath of the Wild, seemed like slam dunk concepts. But both of them, despite executing on their core concepts well enough, never seemed to quite come together into something that captured my imagination or could support an entire game's worth of ideas. So, what's going on here? Why is it that some of the mechanics and systems in games that seem like they're going to be interesting ultimately turn out, kind of the opposite? And how can we tell which ones it's going to happen to? Well, you'll be glad to hear that Mark Rosewater's advice wasn't, as I initially thought, the games have to be boring and predictable in order to be fun. What this distinction really means is that often the fun of games doesn't come from big, flashy individual ideas, which, if allowed to overshadow a game, can lead to shallow and disempowering experiences, but instead from how lots of smaller ideas interact and work together to create much richer gameplay than they ever could alone. The origin of this idea, and the attached quote, comes, as you might expect, from the deep, dark history of Magic the Gathering. Specifically, 2001's Odyssey set, where the Magic design team created a combo of cards designed to disrupt the established metagame of gradually building up a lot of card advantage over time. They created this dog who lets you discard cards whenever you want, and this giant squirrel, who gets really strong when you have a bunch of cards in your graveyard. The intended game plan being to discard your whole hand, buff up the Crosian Beast really fast, and then start battering your opponent to death before they can react. This was a novel and a very powerful strategy, but people hated playing with it. Not because they couldn't understand the threshold mechanic, but because it created really boring gameplay. Either you did the combo, in which case all you could do is attack and hope for the best, or you didn't, in which case you mostly just lost. In other words, it was interesting, but it sure as hell wasn't fun. Now, Mark Rosewater's point here is that it doesn't matter how conceptually interesting a card is to think about, if it isn't fun to play, then it's poorly designed. But I think this idea also taps into a deeper and more fundamental game design truth. In making people throw away the thing they use to interact with the game, their cards, not only did the Crows and Beast combo rob players of the fun of using them, but their potential strategic options became vastly more shallow as well. And it's the interplay and interaction between Magic's incredibly rich suite of cards that makes the game so enjoyable, and is why the game has stuck around for decades. In other words, this superficially interesting strategy destroyed Magic the Gathering's depth, and it's this that I've been talking about the entire time. Depth in video games is something that people reference all the time, but what does it actually mean? Well, simply put, depth when it comes to describing an artistic work, be it a game or a book or a portrait, describes its level of nuance, how many different ways there are to think about it and interpret its constituent parts, or to what level you can manipulate and rearrange what's already there into cool new shapes. The deepest games ever made aren't the biggest or the showiest or the hardest, they're the ones that have the most layers of strategy and understanding to unpack, and they're the ones which constantly seem to evolve the more we play. The likes of Devil May Cry and Factorio are titles you can play for hundreds of hours and constantly find new ways to play them and new layers of mastery to uncover in a way that you can't with equally good but less deep games like, I don't know, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, where you've probably seen basically everything that it has to offer by the time the credits roll. This is even more true for competitive titles, where people are constantly discovering new aspects to their metagames that serves to keep them fresh after decades, or sometimes even centuries, all because of how deep the interactions between their rules go. This, after 2 and a bit pages, is why interesting concepts often don't result in games that are actually fun to play. Oftentimes, a cool idea grabs our attention and seems to stand out, precisely because it operates at odds to what we expect out of a game. But unless this stuff meaningfully intersects with the rest of the game, then it's going to lack the emergent nuances and multifacetedness that come from well-designed, deep systems. Depth isn't something that developers can create simply by adding the right mechanic or following the right design blueprint. It's something that arises organically as we players explore a game, and that means that this foundational form of fun is, unlike other more straightforward reward mechanisms, incredibly fragile. If a designer upsets a game's internal ecosystem by adding something that causes it to become more simplistic and one-dimensional, as we saw with the Crows and Beast, then a game's depth can completely evaporate. And, just as dangerously, if us players are dumb and don't interrogate and explore a game enough, then we may never uncover depth that's been waiting for us to play with the whole time, and as a result, have a bad experience. Through the lens of understanding depth, a lot of related video game mysteries begin to get answered. I wondered for ages why I didn't end up liking Sonic Frontiers, because I've been crying out for an open world Sonic game for ages. Eventually I figured out that because the game's movement tech and the open world stuff, which mostly takes the form of mini-games or combat, rarely actually intersect, it means that you never really get the chance to use Sonic's moveset in a way that makes the most of the format, and thus, the rest of the game feels shallow. I wondered why Watch Dogs never quite worked for me, because the idea of hacking everything and anything seemed really cool, but it's because regardless of how many individual options you have, if none of them really interact with each other in interesting ways, then they all feel essentially interchangeable, and that's kind of because they are. And I didn't quite understand what kept drawing me back to the incredibly silly Horsey game, until I realised that beneath its ridiculous aesthetic and its seeming chaos, there's actually a lot of strategy to the breeding, economy, and races, because of how tightly interwoven all of the dumb mechanics that connect them, like circus performing, actually are. This all begs the question, okay then, if big, flashy, shallow ideas are the opposite of deep gameplay, then how can we as players spot the games with enjoyable depth that can sustain us for hundreds of hours? Well, deep games basically do the opposite. Instead of building themselves around singular, high-concept ideas, a deep game that's rewarding to explore and to master is instead structured around multiple overlapping ideas and systems that keep each other in constant equilibrium. To use a practical example, look at a turn in any deck builder. Let's just say Slay the Spire 2, because I did promise I'd come back to it later. During a single turn, you aren't just maximizing your damage, you need to consider building up statuses and effects to help on future turns, and protect yourself from HP loss, which is persistent across the entire run, with your card rewards and Path Through the Spire needing to be considered in the context of not just your immediate circumstance, but how they interact and synergize with your deck. These hidden meta-level connections and strategic interactions between a game's various mechanics require a lot of work to get right, and a lot of design iteration to join them all up. And in games that seem superficially more complex, or like they've just got more stuff in them, this interconnected structure is often much less robust, and thus less deep, with strategies feeling linear and inflexible, and it being much easier to conclusively solve your strategy because each choice has substantially fewer ramifications. This is why titles with too much going on feel weirdly shallower compared to more elegant, more streamlined games. A game's depth comes from its internal interactions, not just the number of mechanics it has. In deep games, all the different aspects of play are constantly talking to each other and feeding back into the overall equilibrium, with skilled players being able to navigate them in a way that newbies have yet to master and may not even be able to perceive. To look at deck builders again, in something like Dominion, it's hard for a new player to understand why the Chapel, a card that gives you no money, no points, no card draw, and no actions, but instead removes actually useful cards from your deck, is by far the best one in the whole game. But to an expert, the dynamics that make it powerful are so obvious that I'm gonna leave it as a special treat for you to figure out yourself. Equally, in tactics games, the deepest ones, and thus the best ones, are constantly asking you to juggle multiple factors, both in battle and outside of it, with each conflicting and overlapping consideration making the overall strategy much deeper. Unicorn Overlord gives every class some absurdly powerful moves like mega dodging thieves, big tanks that can block for their friends, and mages that take away your attacks, so you need to carefully juggle how your squads are going to counter them by equipping their tactics just right and making sure they act in the right order, leading to some incredibly dense and nuanced interactions between the members of your squads. Other tactics games help to add some depth to even the most generic of battles by having permanent consequences that roll on between fights. The likes of Fire Emblem or Darkest Dungeon have permadeath that means your squad composition will always be changing, and risk is a constant factor that you'll need to juggle alongside everything else. A good litmus test for a deep game is how small of a change you need to make for the interconnected system as a whole to start feeling different to play. For example, in 4X strategy games, the mechanics that each individual faction engages with are more or less always the same. The combat functions are the same, the buildings are mostly the same, the fundamental rules are all the same. But something as tiny as the kin of Sheridan in Endless Legend 2 getting happiness for building military buildings completely upends how you play the game because it has knock-on effects on what you research, your economy, and your diplomatic posture. In Mewgenics, which is a good game that I like in spite of my earlier complaining, introducing a single new ability can open up entirely new strategies that you've never seen before, like how the tank's Rock Crush ability suddenly lets you trivialize all rock-based enemies, and turns the petrification status into an offensive tool, and how adding a mind control bat lets you do some really dumb stuff like tame and insta-killing Daddy Shark who then solos bosses for you by devouring them whole. Hell, for another example, you need only look at the subreddit for literally any MOBA or hero shooter whenever the devs drop the smallest of patches to see how even tiny alterations can cause major freakouts. Actually, don't do that, it's a terrible idea. Buffing one character or changing a small map detail can have major ramifications because the metagames of these titles are so tightly wound and are full of interdependent systems that are impossible to disentangle. Of course, strategic depth can also be reflected on a much more immediate scale too. Deep movement systems in platformers don't come from you sitting down and pondering Sun Tzu between jumps, they're built around multifaceted movesets that tie into each other and that can be leveraged in novel ways. There's a reason why basically every 3D platformer ended up copying Nintendo's approach of giving Mario multiple moves in the air, whether it's air spins, dives, double jumps, fluttering, turning into a weird spinny bat, whatever. All these bonus moves aren't just there to give you a chance to course correct mid-air, they also give you more flexibility and more options while you're in motion, meaning you've always got multiple approaches and things to consider at all times, creating a bunch of emergent depth in how you can string all of these moves together. Trust me, go back and play a really basic platformer like the old Castlevanias where you can't even control your jump height and feel for yourself how stifling and tedious it is to have a really shallow movement system. Racing games are another area where depth can arise out of split-second decisions, because the moment-to-moment choices you make are always going to tie into the wider race. Changing gear or using your handbrake in a more realistic game isn't just about the next corner, it provides knock-on considerations about your acceleration coming out of the turn and will change how you're going to prepare for the next stretch of track. And in more arcadey stuff like F-Zero, juggling your boost meter, which is also your health, in a risk-reward dance necessitates planning and risk management, which ties every choice and every mistake into new considerations about the optimal way you're going to get around the track, something that's much more fulfilling to master than in games where you never need to let go of the accelerator and all you need to do is steer. The bonkers Sonic fan game, Dr. Robotnik's Ring Racers, takes this to an absurd degree by tying not just your ring boost and your health together, but also your attacks, meaning you can't just hold on to your defensive items forever like in Mario Kart, because that locks you out of your ring boost, meaning you go much slower. And on the flip side, you gain access to a powerful melee attack, but only when you're out of rings and in the danger zone. This all seems like a needless imposition, but in linking these mechanics together, instead of separating them, the game forces you to make considerations and trade-offs that you never ordinarily would have to, resulting in a much more nuanced decision tree to master that pushes your skills to their absolute limits. But none of this depth matters if us players never actually get to see it. This is what makes creating a truly deep game such a difficult and rare thing, because it's not enough for a developer to lay down all the overlapping systems and mechanics in such a way that they're constantly interacting in different ways and creating a bunch of nuanced decisions if the player never so much as dips their toe into the potential depth a game has to offer. As an easy example, this is a problem that can be found in a lot of immersive sims. These games make their name on having a whole bunch of systems with emergent complexities that give players loads of gameplay options to consider, or at least that would be the case, were it not for the fact that people almost always go for the most direct, most violent approach they can almost all the time, as there's very little reason not to. Performing a silent infiltration in Hitman, or making a Rube Goldberg trap in Deathloop, is fun largely because of the depth of the systems you're working with. But the problem is that these strategies take ages, and the universal problem solver that is extreme violence is always right there. In fact, a lot of the time I found it's non-violent immersive sims like Control-Alt-Ego and Rel Warped Worlds that avoid this issue and make it much easier to get involved with their deep mechanics, because the more direct path of headshotting the problem away doesn't exist, and therefore your mind is freer to explore more abstract, creative solutions to problems that make better use of the game's mechanics. In a lot of ways, violence in general falls into that same interesting but not fun trap in almost any game that's not solely about combat. It's immediately compelling, but often leads to quite linear, shallow gameplay that feels unsatisfying in the long term because it's not making full use of the game's mechanics. This is also why balance is so important in any game that wants to be deep. It doesn't matter how many potential strategies and gameplay nuances a game can throw at you if they're all terrible compared to the one thing that totally invalidates them. The weird ubiquity of stealth instant kill strategies in many games highlights this very well. If there's a simple, linear way to win every fight that involves no forethought, then the extra gameplay complexity provided by the other, trickier approaches may as well not exist. The same goes for Monster Hunter Wilds, which has an absurdly deep combat system, but that a lot of the time goes entirely unused because you really only need one move, and that's the one that pops monster wounds in order to stun them. A gameplay imbalance that doesn't exist in the older, more simplistic games, weirdly leading them to be strategically deeper despite having less going on. Balance is maybe the keyest way to distinguish depth from mere complexity. In many complex games, depth actually disappears because there are simply too many ways to break the game and oversimplify things by finding an optimal strategy. To quickly look back at Magic the Gathering, this is something that those guys have been struggling with for 30 years, and it's why the game has so many different formats. True balance, especially when it comes to fostering deep play, isn't the same thing as every strategy being equally good or there being a lot of choice, only that there is no one right answer or response to any given situation. Most competitive games, for example, are well known to have some good characters or strategies and a hell of a lot more bad ones. But that doesn't matter, because the good ones that are worth playing still have more than enough deep interplay to sustain an entire metagame. After all, you don't get people whining on chess forums about pawns and kings being underpowered because the relative power of the pieces is all part of the game's strategic design. Hell, the reason why StarCraft is such a deep game, in spite of the fact that many of the units never get used, is because there are still always multifaceted responses to any move your opponent makes. Is a Protoss going for an early expansion economic strategy? Well then you can punish them with Zerg infantry before your foe gets their crucial Vespene gas reserves up and running. But equally, the infamous Zerg rush can be countered with cheap, bulky armoured units that chew up Zerglings and building walls on key choke points, something that makes it harder to move around your base, making a flying, flanking attack in response very powerful. Much like how necessity is the mother of invention, restrictions can also encourage us as players to explore a game's depth when otherwise we'd ignore it, so long as they're used carefully. My favourite bit of the new Zelda games are the shrines where all your gear gets taken away for exactly this reason. Suddenly, you're forced to get creative and engage with all these systemic mechanics that you've not been using the whole time. Equally, stuff like the duels in Ghost of Yotei and enemies in brawlers who are weak to specific techniques are actually great for increasing a game's depth because they exist to remind you of mechanics and strategies that you've always had access to, and show you the virtues of mixing this stuff into your regular gameplay. This is something that goes even further when it comes to player-imposed challenges. Something like a Pokemon Nuzlocke, which adds a whole bunch of bonus rules like permadeath and no items, forces you to change how you approach the game, allowing you to view typically useless status moves in a whole new light, and giving you a new appreciation for the depth of the battle system that existed the whole time, you just never needed to use it because the games are typically so easy. Basically, we have to consider our own role as an integral part of the interconnected, overlapping systems that make deep games not just interesting, but fun too. Because, really, while I've talked a lot about how great games make their nuances easy to engage with, or more palatable, or just, more fun, the real secret of video game depth is that there is an infinity of discoveries and a bottomless well of complexity just waiting to be unearthed in basically all video games and in basically all art. The only thing that really differs between them is in how easy it is to access. People constantly dismiss titles that are really hard or really easy as not being deep, but this couldn't be further from the truth because you just need to know where to look. Something like Noita is rock hard because of the incredible potential of its systemic mechanics that take a while to master because there's just so much going on with them. And there's loads of brain-bending optimization depth to be found in the easygoing Stardew Valley, it's just not necessary to beat the game. Equally, the great tragedy of many pay-to-win games is that they often have some genuinely compelling battle and progression systems that never really get used or appreciated in the way they could be, because of the manipulative surface layer you're forced to engage with before you can get to the good stuff. And sure, Mewgenics might have a case of some of its classes being more conceptually interesting than they are fun, but that doesn't mean that you can't still use them as vehicles to explore the depth of the rest of the game and have a bunch of fun doing so. I had a mage who rolled useless skills, so instead of complaining, what I did was turn him into a mutation farm to pass on his creepy Amigara fault genes to future generations of killers. And another one that wasn't really pulling its weight accidentally ended up saving my whole team when my cleric flooded the lair of an electrified boss because he was able to make safe insulated islands of ice with his otherwise crap passive, saving my run in a really funny way that made me appreciate how deep the game's battle mechanics went because it was still entertaining even when the game was fucking me over. Just think, in almost every game that's ever been made, from the greatest to the crappiest, there exists the potential for experiences as rewarding and multifaceted as the most sublime video game experiences of all time. They're just locked away in the amber of ignorance, and the only thing that separates them is a combination of bad luck and these hidden depths being harder to access. The real sin of the Crozen Beast, Mewgenics' mage, and everything from stealth kills to bad jumps isn't that they somehow, by their nature, destroy a game's nuance, just that they present a design cul-de-sac that makes every game's limitless potential harder to find. This is why it's so important for developers to give players the tools they need to access a game's depth and not to distract them with potentially interesting avenues that ultimately lead nowhere, but also for us players to be willing to put in the work to keep discovering new parts of games we love when the deliberately authored content runs out. Just look at competitive games. Super Smash Bros. Melee was never intended to be a timeless PvP staple. It's a hacked-together, imbalanced, and occasionally completely non-functional game that, nevertheless, incredibly passionate people have found hidden beauty in, and it, alongside basically all competitive games, got that way because people found incredible depth within titles that weren't designed to be anything more than distraction, but where their idiosyncrasies and quirks ended up fitting together in interesting, unexpected ways. Even combos, a bedrock component of fighting games, started out life as a bug that got expanded upon and embraced by passionate players of Street Fighter 2. In fact, while I'm here, it's weird how few games that are explicitly designed for competitive play end up being deep enough to actually support it. Almost all of the big competitive games didn't start with that kind of super hardcore gameplay in mind, which is weird and probably the subject for a different video. This adventurous, exploratory approach to games is the fundamental impulse that drives the speedrunning and modding communities after all. Both of these disciplines involve taking games, dismantling them, turning them inside out, and putting them back together in order to do stuff with them that not even the developers could anticipate. And it's only by looking at games through this lens that you can uncover a whole spectrum of experiences and a bottomless well of emergent depth that existed just out of sight, and yet were weirdly right in front of you the whole time. Speedrunning something requires a totally different point of view on the same familiar gameplay, as mechanics you thought you'd mastered unveil entirely new dimensions, and your existing skills are pushed from entirely different directions. And not only is this a fun new way to play, but there's a deeper satisfaction in speedrunning that comes from cracking open a game to see it from the inside out, revealing its true potential. And modding, far from just being a way to give Cloud a skimpier outfit, allows us to take the raw material of a game's engine, rules, and environments and realise the full scope of their depth that was always within them. When someone makes a crazy content expansion or a balance overhaul of a game they love, they're not replacing something they thought sucked. Making and playing mods is an expression of love and passion for the source material, and it's just another way of exploring the potential that exists within all games. Sometimes a game can even transcend its original form completely and become something like the Doom engine, where getting it to do stupid things like run on a toaster has become a deep game in its own right. By the way, Ring Racers that I mentioned earlier also runs on the Doom engine for reasons that are brilliant and almost entirely explainable by the mass application of autism. So, yeah. 25 years ago, Mark Rosewater designed some crap Magic the Gathering cards, and a bit more recently, Edmund McMillan and Tyler Galil designed some classes that have cool ideas conceptually, but that feel a bit boring in practice. And this goes to show that no matter who you are, or how far gaming as a medium comes, there is always more to discover and more lessons to learn as we as a community continue to uncover how games as a medium tick, and how deep the art form's potential goes. I guess if there's any concrete takeaway from this very rambling video, it's that the idea of artistic depth transcends mere good design practice. It's this fractal, evolving thing that constantly gets more complex the more you look into it. And even when games make mistakes on a strategic level, or lead players astray on an emotional one, these quirks make the story of the game as a whole deeper and more nuanced. So, the next time you play a game and realise that something you were looking forward to was more interesting than it was fun, don't despair. Because I think we'd all much rather have games that are deeper in some areas than they are in others due to design risks, than have games that aren't deep at all because they spent all of their effort on surface level gimmicks. And chances are that even if there isn't any compelling depth to be found where you thought it would be, you'll be able to find more than enough depth to satisfy you if you just keep looking. Which is of course why I have over 100 hours on Mewgenics. It's not because I like it, oh no, gross, I'm doing dry intellectual design analysis, yeah, obviously, it's not because it's fun or my favourite game of the year so far or anything, no. Hello and welcome to the After the Video segment. Whew, I am sorry this one took so long. It has been, to be brief, a fucking nightmare to put this one together. I had to scrap a whole different video completely 3 weeks in, and then I had to cobble this one together at lightning speed to get it out in a semi-reasonable time frame. My bad, I feel awful. Sorry. Anyway, even if you don't want to listen to me complaining, what you should want to listen to is a little recommendation, and that is for a video game comedy podcast by the name of Button Boys, starring three people that English stand-up fans may recognise in the form of Glenn Moore, Sarah Keyworth, and Pierre Novelli. Button Boys is great primarily for the fact that it's the only video game podcast ever that makes a point of not talking about industry news, which, let's be frank, isn't very much fun a lot of the time and can get very repetitive. And instead, these two boys and one not boy are able to focus on being easily the funniest gaming podcast that I've ever listened to, and I know that's high praise. In particular, I highly recommend watching the three of them make a lot of really bold predictions about games they're looking forward to, only for most of said picks to end up being absolute crap. It's really funny every time. Go check them out. Of course, if you do want to listen to me complain, well then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon or YouTube memberships, because if you do, you'll get special privileged access to all kinds of extra goodies that I spend a whole bunch of time and effort on. You want bonus videos, extra game recommendations, your name in the credits, behind the scenes stuff? You got it, along with my eternal gratitude for helping keep the channel running, and my preemptive forgiveness for you ad blocking this video. I say that because 1 month of direct financial support is worth more than a lifetime of ad views, so as far as I'm concerned, go ahead and ad block them if you give me money. It sounds pretty fair, right? Of course, there's one other thing, and that's for my $10 supporters who get a voiced shout out right at the end. And those people are Ali Wright, Andrew Lebrano, Anna94, Baroness Caroline, Bobby, Constantine Amend, Cosmix360, Daniel Metjes, Daniel Ursin, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Digletier, Dis Ellie, Ecton, Edward Franklin Woods, Edwina the Space Bun, Eric Woolston, Eugene Bulkin, Fullabaxi, Furious Hulk, Gazcol, How, Hecate Noah, I Support Trans Rights, I'm So Glad You Weren't Eaten, Jacob Dillon Riddle, Jinkaloid, Kevin Help Us, Conolov, Kangi, Leap Year Every Day, Luke Kokoran, Mace Window 54, Mark Vallant, Mika Oy, Michael C., Mike Oxlong, Nate Graff, Oliver Marhofer, Patrick Romberg, Peter Tomasik, Rededex, Regal Regex, Sandemus Vestibule Consortium, Seslux, Silver Forthy, Tyler Duncan, Timoteus Beksek, Whimsical Wisp, Zach Brandmeier, and ciao. Okay, that's it from me. The next one will be quicker, I promise. Bye!